This is the epic story of Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni tribe, who led one of the most devastating revolts against the Roman Empire in 60 to 61 CE. The narrative follows her transformation from a respected tribal queen living in relative peace under Roman occupation to a vengeful commander, leading tens of thousands of Britons in a bloody uprising that nearly drove Rome out of Britain. The script progresses through several key phases. The uneasy peace between the Iceni and Rome, the brutal betrayal following her husband's death, the ignition of rebellion as Boudica rallies the tribes, the triumphant destruction of 3 Roman cities including Londinium, London, and finally the tragic climax where superior Roman military tactics turn the tide. The story concludes with reflection on her enduring legacy as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The conflict builds from personal violation to tribal uprising to full-scale war, with tension escalating as Boudica's forces grow more powerful before the inevitable confrontation with Rome's disciplined legions. The resolution is bittersweet defeat in battle, but immortality in memory. In the year 60 CE, on the wind-swept plains of ancient Britain, a storm was brewing. Not in the skies above, but in the heart of a queen whose world had been shattered by the cruelest of betrayals. Her name was Boudica, a name that would soon echo through the corridors of Roman power with a fury that shook an empire to its core. This is not a story of conquest for glory. This is not a tale of ambition or expansion. This is the story of a woman who rose from the ashes of unimaginable violence to become one of Rome's most feared enemies. A woman who, with nothing but righteous rage and the loyalty of her people, brought the greatest military machine the world had ever known to the brink of collapse. Long before Boudica's name became synonymous with rebellion, the island of Britain was a land of tribes. Dozens of them, each with their own territories, customs, and kings. The Iceni were one such tribe, dwelling in what is now East Anglia, in the fertile lowlands where rivers carved through ancient forests and the North Sea breathed salt into the air. The Iceni were fierce, they were proud. They were warriors who had defended their lands for generations, long before Rome ever cast its shadow across the Channel. But by the time Boudica became queen, the world had changed. Rome had arrived. In 43 CE, under Emperor Claudius, Roman legions invaded Britain with a force that was overwhelming, disciplined, and utterly relentless. Tribe after tribe fell before them, some through conquest, others through treaties that promised protection in exchange for loyalty. The Iceni chose the latter. Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, had negotiated a delicate arrangement with Rome. The Iceni would remain semi-independent, allied to Rome but not enslaved by it. In return, they would pay tribute and acknowledge Roman authority. For nearly 2 decades, this fragile peace held. Prasutagus ruled his people wisely, maintaining their traditions while navigating the dangerous waters of Roman occupation. Boudica stood beside him not as a decorative figure, but as a partner. In Celtic society, women could hold power, they could inherit land, they could lead, and Boudica was no ordinary woman. She was tall, with a commanding presence that demanded respect. Ancient sources describe her as fierce-eyed and sharp-tongued, with long red hair that fell past her waist like a banner of war. Together, Prasutagus and Boudica raised 2 daughters in a world that was changing too fast. They taught them the old ways, the language of their ancestors, the stories of their gods, the pride of the Iceni. But they also prepared them for a future shaped by Rome. Then, in the year 60 CE, King Prasutagus died. His death was not violent. It was natural, perhaps even expected given his age. But what followed was anything but natural. In his final act as king, Prasutagus had tried to protect his family and his people. He left a will, a carefully crafted document that divided his wealth and lands between his 2 daughters and the Roman Emperor Nero. It was a desperate compromise, an attempt to secure his family's future while appeasing Rome. But Rome did not honor compromise. Rome took what it wanted. When Roman officials arrived to claim the emperor's share, they brought more than legal documents. They brought soldiers, they brought contempt, and they brought violence. What happened next would ignite a firestorm that would consume southern Britain and leave 3 cities in ruins. The Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, saw Prasutagus' death not as a time for diplomacy, but as an opportunity. The Iceni lands were wealthy. The royal family possessed gold, silver, livestock, and fertile territory. And with Prasutagus gone, there was no king to protect them, only a widow and 2 young girls. So Rome took everything. Roman soldiers stormed the Iceni royal household. They seized land, they confiscated treasures, they declared debts that had never existed and demanded immediate repayment. Iceni nobles who protested were stripped of their titles and property. Some were enslaved outright. But the worst atrocity was reserved for the royal family itself. Boudica, the queen of the Iceni, was publicly flogged, whipped like a common criminal, humiliated before her people as Roman soldiers laughed and jeered. Her daughters, girls barely old enough to understand the cruelty of the world, were dragged away and raped by Roman soldiers. The message was clear: you are nothing, you have no power, you are subjects of Rome, and Rome will do with you as it pleases. But Rome had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had not broken Boudica. They had forged her into something far more dangerous. In the days following the assault, Boudica did not retreat into grief. She did not hide in shame. She did something that would change the course of history. She called the tribes to war. Across the lowlands and forests of eastern Britain, word spread like wildfire. The Iceni queen had been violated. Her daughters had been brutalized. Roman arrogance had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and Boudica, scarred but unbroken, was rallying her people. The call to arms was not just about revenge, it was about survival, it was about dignity, it was about reclaiming a world that Rome had stolen. And the tribes answered. The Trinovantes, who had suffered under Roman taxation and land seizures, joined immediately. They had watched their sacred groves burned, their leaders humiliated, their children taken as hostages. They were ready to fight. Other tribes followed: the Cornavi, the Durotriges. Warriors from across southern Britain, men and women alike, gathered beneath Boudica's banner. This was not a professional army. These were farmers, hunters, craftsmen, ordinary people pushed beyond endurance. But they were fierce, they were angry, and they were countless. Ancient historians estimate that Boudica's force swelled to over 100,000 warriors, a staggering number, even if exaggerated. They came with swords, spears, clubs, and axes. They came in chariots, the traditional Celtic war machines that had terrorized enemies for centuries. And at their head rode Boudica herself, her red hair streaming behind her, her voice rising above the roar of the crowd. The Roman historian Cassius Dio recorded a speech Boudica gave to her assembled forces. Though the exact words are lost to time, the sentiment was clear. We fight not for empire, but for freedom. Not for wealth, but for our children. Not for glory, but for the right to live as our ancestors lived, unbowed, unbroken, and free. The rebellion had begun. The first target was Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester. Camulodunum was not just any Roman settlement, it was a symbol. It had been the capital of the Trinovantes before Rome conquered it and transformed it into a colonia, a settlement for retired Roman soldiers. The veterans who lived there had seized Trinovantes' land without compensation, treating the native population as little more than slaves in their own homeland. At the center of the city stood a massive temple dedicated to Emperor Claudius, a monument to Roman arrogance and divine pretension. The Britons hated it. When Boudica's army descended upon Camulodunum, the city was almost defenseless. The Roman military presence was minimal. Most legions were far to the north and west, campaigning in Wales and Anglesey under the command of Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. The veterans and civilians who remained sent desperate pleas for help. Catus Decianus, the procurator whose greed had sparked the rebellion, sent a pitiful force of 200 poorly armed men. it was nowhere near enough. Boudica's warriors swept through Camulodunum like a tidal wave of vengeance. They burned the buildings, they tore down the temple, they slaughtered every Roman they found, men, women, children. No mercy was given because none had been shown. The archaeological record confirms the horror. Excavations at Colchester have uncovered a thick layer of burnt debris dating to this period: charred wood, melted metal, and human remains. The city was utterly destroyed. But Boudica was not finished. News of the massacre reached the 9th Legion, stationed to the north. Quintus Petilius Cerealis, the legion's commander, immediately marched south with approximately 2,000 infantry to crush the rebellion before it spread further. It was a fatal miscalculation. Boudica's forces ambushed the 9th Legion in open country. The Roman infantry, disciplined and heavily armored, were surrounded by a howling mass of Britons who attacked from all sides. Chariots thundered through their ranks, spears and arrows rained down. The legionaries, trained for set-piece battles, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers and ferocity. The 9th Legion was annihilated. Cerealis himself barely escaped with his cavalry, fleeing north and leaving his infantry to die. It was one of the worst defeats Rome had suffered in Britain. With 2 victories in rapid succession, Boudica's army grew even larger. Hope surged through the tribes. Rome, it seemed, was not invincible. The rebels turned their sights on the next target, Londinium. Londinium, modern London, was not yet the grand metropolis it would become. In 60 CE, it was a bustling commercial hub, a thriving port where Roman merchants traded goods from across the empire. It had no walls, no significant garrison, and no means of defense. When Governor Suetonius Paulinus received word of the rebellion, he was far to the northwest, having just completed a brutal campaign on the island of Mona Anglesey, where he had slaughtered Druid priests and burned their sacred groves. He immediately rushed southeast with his cavalry, racing to assess the situation. Upon reaching Londinium, Suetonius made a cold, calculated decision. The city could not be defended. He had too few troops, and Boudica's army was too large and too close. If he tried to hold Londinium, he would lose his forces and achieve nothing. So he abandoned it. Suetonius ordered the evacuation of anyone who could travel: merchants, officials, anyone capable of fleeing. But thousands remained: the old, the sick, those too attached to their homes and businesses to leave. They believed the governor would return. They believed Rome would protect them. They were wrong. Boudica's army arrived shortly after Suetonius's departure. What followed was a massacre that would be remembered for centuries. Londinium burned. The Britons showed no restraint, no hesitation. Every Roman, every collaborator, every merchant who had profited from the occupation was hunted down. Buildings were set ablaze. Warehouses filled with goods were looted and destroyed. The wooden structures that made up most of the city became a roaring inferno, visible for miles. Archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture. Beneath modern London lies a layer of red-orange burnt clay mixed with ash and charred debris. This destruction layer, dating precisely to 60 to 61 CE, stretches across much of the ancient city centre. It is the physical scar left by Boudica's wrath. Ancient historians record that the Britons did not take prisoners. They did not enslave survivors. They killed everyone they found. Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, claimed that the Britons engaged in ritualistic brutality, hanging nobles, impaling others, and making sacrifices to their war goddess, Andraste. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or colored by Roman propaganda is debated by modern scholars, but what is certain is that the destruction was total. Londinium ceased to exist as a functioning settlement. It would not be rebuilt for years. With Londinium in ashes, Boudica's army marched on the third and final target, Verulamium, known today as Street Albans. Verulamium was different from Camulodunum and Londinium. It was not a Roman military colony or a commercial port. It was a municipium, a settlement of Romanized Britons, natives who had adopted Roman customs, language, and lifestyle. They had collaborated with the occupiers, embraced Roman culture, and prospered under Roman rule. To Boudica and her followers, they were traitors. Verulamium was destroyed with the same ferocity as the previous cities. The Britons showed no leniency to their own people who had sided with Rome. The city was burned to the ground, its inhabitants slaughtered. Another destruction layer in the archaeological record marks this event: more ash, more charred remains, more evidence of total annihilation. In less than a month, Boudica's rebellion had destroyed 3 major settlements and killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people, according to the Roman historian Tacitus. If accurate, this made it one of the bloodiest uprisings in Roman history. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Boudica might actually drive Rome out of Britain entirely. But Rome was not defeated yet. Governor Suetonius Paulinus had regrouped. He had gathered the 14th Legion and parts of the 20th Legion, along with auxiliary units, a total force of around 10,000 men. It was a fraction of the size of Boudica's army, but it was professional, disciplined, and led by one of Rome's most experienced commanders. Suetonius knew he could not afford to retreat further. If he abandoned Britain, his career would be over, and Rome's reputation would be shattered. He had to make a stand. He chose his battlefield carefully. Somewhere in the Midlands, historians still debate the exact location Suetonius found a site that negated Boudica's numerical advantage. It was a narrow valley with dense forest on both sides, funneling any attacking force into a confined space. Behind his army, a hillside provided high ground. In front, a clear killing field stretched out. It was a trap, and Boudica walked into it. When the British army arrived, they numbered perhaps 100,000 or more men, women, and even families who had come to witness what they believed would be the final victory over Rome. They brought wagons and carts, positioning them in a semicircle behind their warriors to watch the battle as if it were a spectacle. Boudica addressed her people one last time. Ancient sources claim she invoked the goddess Andraste, releasing a hair from her cloak as a ritual for victory. She reminded her warriors of the atrocities Rome had inflicted. She reminded them that they were fighting for their children, their land, their very souls. The Britons charged. It was a mistake. The narrow valley forced the British warriors into a dense, disorganized mass. They could not flank the Romans. They could not use their superior numbers effectively. And as they surged forward, the Roman legionaries stood firm. On Suetonius's command, the Romans unleashed a devastating volley of javelins, heavy throwing spears designed to pierce shields and armor. Thousands of Britons fell in the first moments, but still they came. The two sides collided in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Britons fought with courage and fury, but the Romans fought with precision and discipline. The legionaries moved as a single unit, shields locked, swords stabbing in coordinated thrusts. The British warriors, brave as they were, fought as individuals. Slowly, methodically, the Romans pushed forward. The Britons began to falter. Panic spread. Warriors tried to retreat, but the wagons they had positioned behind them now became a death trap, blocking escape routes and creating chaos. The retreat turned into a rout. Roman soldiers pursued the fleeing Britons without mercy, cutting down men, women, and children alike. Tacitus claims that 80,000 Britons died that day, compared to only 400 Roman casualties. Even accounting for exaggeration, the slaughter was immense. Boudica survived the battle, but her cause was lost. The details of Boudica's final days are shrouded in mystery and legend. According to Tacitus, she took poison shortly after the battle, choosing death over capture and the humiliation that would follow. She would not give Rome the satisfaction of parading her through the streets of the capital in chains, a trophy of conquest. She would not allow her daughters to suffer further indignity. Cassius Dio offers a different account, suggesting that Boudica fell ill and died, her body racked by sickness and exhaustion after the long campaign. Her people, grief-stricken and broken, gave her a lavish burial befitting a queen, though the location of her grave has never been found. Some legends claim she is buried beneath Platform 10 of King's Cross Station in London. Others say her resting place lies somewhere in the countryside of East Anglia, hidden and protected by the descendants of those who loved her. To this day, no archaeological evidence has confirmed her final resting place. She remains, even in death, elusive and unconquered. With Boudica gone, the rebellion collapsed. The tribes scattered, returning to their lands to face Roman retribution, and retribution came swiftly. Governor Suetonius Paulinus unleashed a campaign of brutal reprisals. He swept through the territories of the Iceni and their allies with fire and sword, destroying villages, slaughtering livestock, and burning crops. The goal was not just punishment, it was annihilation. The Roman policy was clear. The Britons would be made an example. Any tribe that dared to defy Rome would face total destruction. Famine spread across the region. Thousands died not in battle, but from starvation and desperation. But Suetonius's savagery eventually drew criticism even from Rome itself. The new imperial agent, Julius Classicianus, sent reports back to Emperor Nero, arguing that Suetonius's cruelty was counterproductive. If Rome wanted to control Britain, it needed cooperation, not wholesale extermination. Continuing the bloodshed would only breed more resentment and future rebellions. Nero, influenced by these reports and eager to avoid further instability, recalled Suetonius. A more conciliatory governor was appointed. Policies shifted. Taxes were reduced. Efforts were made to rebuild the destroyed cities and restore some measure of peace. Slowly, painfully, Roman Britain began to stabilize. Londinium was rebuilt, this time with walls. Camulodunum and Verulamium rose from their ashes. The Roman presence became permanent, entrenched, and ultimately enduring for nearly 4 more centuries. But the memory of Boudica did not fade. For the Britons, she became a symbol, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, resistance was possible, that dignity and honor were worth fighting for. That a single woman, armed with nothing but courage and the loyalty of her people, could bring an empire to its knees. The Romans too remembered her, but with a mixture of respect and fear. Tacitus, writing decades later, acknowledged her as a formidable leader. He did not diminish her accomplishments or her intelligence. He recognized that Rome had faced not a barbarian rabble, but a genuine threat. Cassius Dio, writing even later, described her in vivid detail: her towering presence, her fierce voice, her ability to command and inspire. Even through the lens of Roman propaganda, the respect for her strength is unmistakable. In the centuries that followed, Boudica's story was passed down through oral tradition among the Britons. When Roman Britain eventually fell and new kingdoms rose, her tale survived in fragmented form, woven into the myths and legends of the island's past. By the medieval period, she was largely forgotten, overshadowed by other heroes and the rise of Arthurian legend. But she did not disappear entirely. Chroniclers and historians occasionally referenced her, preserving the bones of her story even as details blurred. Then, in the 16th century, the story of Boudica was rediscovered. As England under Queen Elizabeth I sought to assert its identity and independence, the tale of a warrior queen who defied a great empire resonated powerfully. Boudica was reimagined as a proto-British national hero, a symbol of resistance, sovereignty, and fierce independence. By the Victorian era, she had become an icon. Statues were erected, poems were written. She was celebrated as the embodiment of British courage and defiance. In 1902, a bronze statue of Boudica riding a chariot was unveiled on Westminster Bridge in London, just a short distance from where the city she once burned to the ground now thrives as a global metropolis. The statue shows her with her daughters, charging forward with spears raised, her expression one of righteous fury. It is a monument not just to her, but to the idea that some things, freedom, dignity, justice, are worth any sacrifice. Today, Boudica's legacy is complex and multifaceted. She is celebrated as a feminist icon, a powerful woman who commanded armies in a male-dominated world. She is honored as a symbol of anti-imperialism and resistance to tyranny. She is remembered as a mother who fought not for power, but to protect her children and her people. But she is also a reminder of the brutality of war. Her rebellion was not bloodless. Thousands of innocent people died in the destruction of Londinium, Camulodunum, and Verulamium. Civilians who had little to do with the policies of Roman governors or the cruelty of soldiers. The violence she unleashed was total and indiscriminate. This duality is part of what makes her story so compelling. Boudica was not a simple hero or villain. She was a human being pushed to the edge by unthinkable trauma, who made choices that changed the course of history. Historians continue to debate the details of her life and rebellion. Was she a brilliant military strategist or simply a figurehead for a movement driven by collective rage? Did she truly command the loyalty of 100,000 warriors, or are those numbers exaggerated by ancient sources? What were her true motivations, revenge, justice, or something deeper? We will never know for certain. The historical record is incomplete, colored by Roman perspectives, and filtered through centuries of myth-making. But what is certain is this: Boudica existed, she fought, and she came closer than anyone before or since to driving Rome out of Britain. In the end, Boudica's story is not just about one woman or one rebellion. It is about the eternal struggle between power and freedom, between oppression and dignity, between empires and the people they seek to control. Rome, for all its might and grandeur, was not invincible. It could be challenged, it could hurt, and it could be forced to reckon with the consequences of its cruelty. Boudica's rebellion did not succeed in driving Rome from Britain, but it succeeded in something perhaps more important. It proved that resistance was possible. It sent a message that would echo through the ages. No empire, no matter how powerful, can completely crush the human spirit. Her story has inspired countless others across the centuries. Leaders of oppressed peoples have looked to her example when facing overwhelming odds. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have drawn on her legend to explore themes of justice, vengeance, and the cost of freedom. In modern Britain, she is a national hero. Her image appears in literature, on currency, in popular culture. She is taught in schools as a symbol of courage and resistance. Every year, thousands of tourists visit the sites associated with her rebellion: Colchester Street, Albans, and the statue on Westminster Bridge. But her legacy extends far beyond Britain. Around the world, people who have faced colonization, occupation, and injustice see themselves in Boudica's struggle. She represents the colonized fighting back against the colonizer, the powerless standing up to the powerful, the silenced refusing to be silent any longer. Her story resonates with movements for independence and liberation across history, from the American Revolution to anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Asia, from indigenous resistance in the Americas to modern fights for sovereignty and self-determination. She is a symbol of what can happen when people are pushed too far, when their dignity is stripped away, when their loved ones are harmed, when their very existence is threatened. In those moments, empires learn a hard lesson. Oppression breeds resistance, and cruelty begets fury. Yet, there is also a cautionary element to her story. The rebellion Boudica led was born of justified rage, but it resulted in immense suffering on all sides. The destruction of Londinium and the other cities killed not just Roman soldiers and officials, but countless ordinary people, traders, artisans, families who had no say in the policies that sparked the revolt. War, even when justified, exacts a terrible price, and the aftermath of Boudica's rebellion brought famine and devastation to the very people she sought to protect. The Roman reprisals were merciless, and the Iceni and their allies paid dearly for their defiance. This complexity is what makes Boudica's story endure. She is not a one-dimensional figure of pure heroism or villainy. She is a reflection of the messy, painful reality of resistance and the high stakes of standing against power. In literature and art, Boudica has been reimagined countless times. In some portrayals, she is a tragic heroine, noble, doomed, fighting a losing battle with grace and dignity. In others, she is a fierce warrior, unstoppable, terrifying, a force of nature. Still others depict her as a grieving mother, driven by love and loss to do the unthinkable. Each interpretation reveals something about the era in which it was created. The Victorians saw her as a symbol of empire and national pride. Modern feminists see her as an emblem of women's power and agency. Post-colonial scholars see her as a figure of anti-imperial resistance. All of these perspectives are valid because Boudica's story is big enough to contain them all. What remains undeniable is the sheer audacity of what she accomplished. In an age when Rome seemed unstoppable, when its legions had conquered from Britain to the deserts of the Middle East, a woman from a small tribe in the eastern fringes of the empire led a rebellion that nearly destroyed Roman Britain. She had no formal military training, she had no standing army, she had no resources comparable to Rome's. What she had was conviction, courage, and the ability to unite fractured tribes under a single cause. For a brief, blazing moment, she made Rome tremble. And though her rebellion ultimately failed, the impact was felt for generations. Rome never took Britain for granted again. Policies were reformed, governors were more cautious. The cost of occupation was reassessed. Boudica had forced the empire to change, and in doing so, she achieved a victory that transcended the battlefield. Her name, which in the Celtic language means victory or victorious, carries an irony that history has not forgotten. She did not achieve military victory in the end, but she won something more enduring, a place in memory that no conqueror could ever erase. Today, when we speak of Boudica, we speak of more than historical facts and ancient battles. We speak of courage in the face of impossible odds. We speak of the refusal to be broken, no matter the cost. We speak of the power of an individual to inspire collective action and change the course of history. We speak of a woman who, against all expectations and in defiance of every force arrayed against her, stood up and fought back. Her story is a reminder that history is not just made by emperors and generals, but by ordinary people pushed to extraordinary acts. It is a reminder that justice and freedom are worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible. And it is a reminder that some names, once carved into the annals of history, can never be erased, no matter how many empires rise and fall. Boudica of the Iceni, warrior, queen, mother, rebel, legend. She stopped Rome, if not forever, then long enough to prove that it could be done. And in doing so, she became immortal. Centuries have passed since Boudica rode into battle, her red hair streaming behind her like a war banner. The chariots have rusted, the swords have dulled. The fires that consumed Londinium have long since cooled to ash. But her story, her defiance, her fury, her unyielding spirit burns as brightly now as it did in the smoke-filled skies of 60 CE. She has become more than a historical figure. She has become a myth, a symbol, an idea that transcends time and geography. And myths, unlike people, do not die. In the modern world, Boudica's image appears in unexpected places. Her statue on Westminster Bridge stands as a guardian of London, the city she once destroyed. It is a strange, poetic irony. The queen who razed Londinium to the ground now watches over its successor, a silent witness to centuries of change. Tourists photograph her bronze likeness. Schoolchildren learn her name. Historians debate the details of her campaigns. And somewhere beneath the streets of London, buried deep in the earth, lies that red-orange layer of burnt clay, the scar she left on history, still visible to those who know where to look. But Boudica's reach extends far beyond Britain. Her story has been told and retold in dozens of languages, across continents and cultures. She appears in novels, films, television shows, and video games. She is invoked in speeches and protests. Her name is a rallying cry for those who refuse to submit. Why does her story endure? Perhaps it is because her struggle is universal. Every culture, Every nation, every people has faced moments when they must decide whether to bend or break, to submit or resist. Boudica chose resistance, and in doing so, she gave voice to a fundamental human truth. Freedom is worth fighting for, even when the odds are hopeless. Or perhaps it is because she was a woman in a world dominated by men, yet she commanded armies, inspired nations, and struck fear into the heart of an empire. In an era when most women were invisible to history, Boudica made herself impossible to ignore. Her daughters, whose names history did not even bother to record, were violated as a message of Roman dominance. But Boudica turned that message into a call to arms. She transformed personal trauma into collective action. She took her pain and weaponized it, not just for revenge, but for the liberation of her people. This is what makes her story resonate in the modern age. She is not just a warrior. She is a survivor who refused to remain a victim. She is a leader who turned grief into power. She is a mother who fought so that her daughters and all the daughters of Britain might live free. Of course, history is never simple, and heroes are never perfect. Boudica's rebellion left a trail of blood. The thousands who died in Londinium, Camulodunum, and Verulamium were not all soldiers or oppressors. Many were ordinary people, merchants, craftsmen, women, children, caught in the crossfire of a war they did not start. Can we honor Boudica's courage while also acknowledging the cost of her rebellion? Can we celebrate her resistance while mourning the innocent lives lost? The answer is yes, because to do otherwise would be to reduce history to simplistic narratives of good versus evil. Boudica was not a saint. She was a human being, flawed and fierce, who made choices in the crucible of unimaginable pain. She lived in a brutal age, in a brutal world, and she responded with brutality. That does not erase her courage, it does not diminish her legacy, it makes her real. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of her story. Heroism is not about perfection. It is about standing up when everything in you says to fall down. It is about fighting back when surrender would be easier. It is about choosing action over despair. Boudica could have accepted her fate. She could have hidden in grief after the assault on her family. She could have lived the rest of her days in quiet humiliation, just another victim of Roman conquest. But she did not. She rose. She rallied. She roared. And for a brief, blazing moment, the greatest empire the world had ever known trembled before her. In the 21st century, Boudica's story is more relevant than ever. We live in a time of resurgent authoritarianism, of empires, economic, military, cultural, exerting control over the lives of millions. We live in a time when the powerful seem untouchable, when injustice feels overwhelming, when the idea of resistance can seem futile. But Boudica's story reminds us, empires are not invincible, power can be challenged, and even when resistance fails, it matters. It matters because it changes the calculus of oppression. It forces those in power to reckon with the cost of cruelty. It inspires others, in other times and places, to stand up and say, no more. Boudica did not defeat Rome, but she bloodied its nose. She exposed its vulnerabilities. She proved that even the mightiest empire could be hurt. And in doing so, she ensured that her name would be remembered long after the names of the emperors who ruled Rome in her time had faded into obscurity. Who remembers Nero, except as a tyrant? Who remembers Catuus Decianus, except as the greedy procurator whose cruelty sparked a firestorm? Who remembers Governor Suetonius Paulinus, except as the man who barely held Britain together in the face of a woman's wrath? But Boudica, her name endures, her story lives, her legacy inspires. She is the warrior queen who stopped Rome, not forever, but long enough to matter, long enough to prove that it could be done. Long enough to carve her name into the bedrock of history with a blade of fire and fury. And that, in the end, is victory enough. So, when you walk through London, past the bronze statue of Boudica on Westminster Bridge, take a moment to look up, see the Queen with her daughters, charging forward into battle, fearless and undaunted. Remember that beneath your feet lies the city she destroyed and the city that rose from its ashes. Remember that history is not just written by the victors, it is also written by those who dared to fight back, even when they knew they would lose. Remember Boudica. Remember her courage, remember her rage, remember her love for her people and her refusal to be broken. And remember that empires rise and empires fall, but the spirit of resistance is eternal. The wind sweeps across the plains of East Anglia, just as it did 2,000 years ago. The rivers still carve their ancient paths through the land. The forests, though smaller now, still stand. And somewhere in that earth, perhaps beneath a farmer's field or a forgotten hillside, Boudica rests. We do not know where. We may never know. But perhaps that is fitting. She was a queen without a throne, a general without an army of her own training, a rebel without a country to call free. She lived in the margins of history, in the space between the fall of one world and the rise of another. She fought not to build an empire, but to destroy one. She sought not glory, but justice. And in the end, she disappeared not into defeat, but into legend. Legends do not need graves, they do not need monuments. They live in the hearts and minds of those who hear their stories and feel, in their bones, the truth they carry. Boudica's truth is this: you are not powerless, you are not voiceless, and you are not alone. When injustice comes, when cruelty strikes, when the powerful try to crush you beneath their heel, you have a choice. You can submit, or you can resist. You can accept the world as it is, or you can fight to change it. Boudica chose to fight, and in doing so, she became immortal. Her story is not just for historians and scholars. It is not confined to dusty textbooks or academic debates. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt powerless, anyone who has ever faced impossible odds, anyone who has ever wondered if standing up is worth the risk. It is for the colonized peoples who have fought for independence. It is for the women who have demanded equality in a world that told them to be silent. It is for the marginalized, the oppressed, the forgotten, those who have been told they do not matter. Boudica says, you do matter. Your voice matters. Your resistance matters. Even if you fail. Even if the empire wins. Even if your name is forgotten by everyone but a few, you matter. Because every act of resistance, no matter how small, changes the world. It plants a seed. It shifts the balance. It reminds those in power that they are not invincible. And sometimes, if the stars align and the people unite, resistance succeeds, empires fall, tyrants are toppled, freedom, hard-won and blood-soaked, is claimed. But even when it doesn't, even when the battle is lost, the fight itself is sacred. Boudica lost her final battle. She did not live to see Rome driven from Britain. She did not see her daughters grow old in a free land. She did not witness the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire, centuries after her death. But she won something more precious than victory on the battlefield. She won her place in eternity. She won the knowledge that she had fought back, that she had not gone quietly into the darkness, that she had made them pay for every inch of ground they took. She won the love and loyalty of her people, who remembered her long after Rome had forgotten the names of its own governors. And she won the respect, grudging, fearful but real, of the very empire she sought to destroy. Rome never forgot Boudica. Her rebellion was a scar on the imperial psyche, a reminder that conquest came with a cost. Future governors in Britain were more cautious, taxes were reconsidered, policies were adjusted. The empire learned because Boudica forced it to learn. And in that way, she shaped the future not just of Britain but of Rome itself. Today, we live in a world that Boudica could never have imagined. The Roman Empire is gone, its ruins scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean. The tribes of ancient Britain have long since vanished, absorbed into new nations and cultures. The gods, Boudica prayed to Andraste, the goddess of victory, are no longer worshipped. But the struggle she embodied continues. Around the world, people still fight for freedom. They still resist oppression. They still stand up to empires. whether those empires are built on military might, economic dominance, or cultural hegemony. And when they do, they walk in the footsteps of Boudica. Her story is a torch passed down through the generations. It lights the way for those who come after, showing them that resistance is not futile, that courage is not wasted, that standing up, even when you stand alone, is always the right choice. So let us remember her, not just as a historical curiosity, not just as a footnote in the story of Rome, but as a beacon. Let us remember that she was a woman who loved her family, who cared for her people, who sought nothing more than to live in peace until peace was stolen from her. Let us remember that when everything was taken, she did not despair. She did not retreat. She transformed her pain into power and her grief into a weapon. Let us remember that she united fractured tribes, inspired tens of thousands to follow her, and led them to victories that Rome never imagined possible. Let us remember that she burned cities to the ground, crushed legions, and came closer than anyone to driving the greatest empire on earth from her homeland. Let us remember that she fell, not in shame, but in defiance, choosing death on her own terms rather than submission. And let us remember that her story did not end with her death. It lived on, passed down through generations, rediscovered and retold, reimagined and revered. Boudica of the Iceni, the warrior queen who stopped Rome. She did not win every battle. She did not see the world she fought for. She did not live to old age, surrounded by grandchildren and peace. But she did something perhaps more important. She refused to be forgotten. And in doing so, she became eternal. The flames she lit in Londinium have long since died. The blood spilled on that final battlefield has been washed away by centuries of rain. The chariots have crumbled, the swords have rusted. The empire she fought has fallen into dust. But her name remains. Speak it, and you summon the spirit of resistance. Speak it, and you honor the courage of all who have stood against tyranny. Speak it, and you remember that empires are temporary, but the human spirit is eternal. She was a queen, a warrior, a mother, a rebel, and she was, and will always be, victorious. Not because she won every battle, but because she fought them. Not because she destroyed Rome, but because she proved it could be challenged. Not because history remembers her perfectly, but because it remembers her at all. That is her legacy. That is her gift to the future. And that is why, 2,000 years later, we still tell her story. Because some fires once lit can never be extinguished. And some names, once carved into the heart of history, can never be erased. In every act of courage, in every moment of defiance, in every soul that refuses to submit, she lives. And as long as people fight for freedom, she always will. The story of Boudica ends here, but the questions she raises do not. What would Britain have been if she had won? Would the island have remained free, a patchwork of tribes resisting Roman culture and control? Or would internal divisions have torn the rebellion apart, leading to chaos and eventual reconquest? What would the world have been if Rome had been driven from Britain? Would the empire have faltered elsewhere, or would it have simply refocused its energies on other frontiers? Would Britain have developed differently, maintaining its Celtic culture and languages, or would it have been conquered by someone else, Saxons, Vikings, Normans who came later? We will never know. History does not offer us alternate timelines or second chances. It gives us only what was, not what might have been. But we can know this. Boudica mattered. Her rebellion, though ultimately unsuccessful, changed the trajectory of Roman Britain. It forced Rome to reconsider its methods, to treat the Britons with more caution, to remember that conquest is not the same as control. Her story, passed down through the ages, has inspired countless others to stand up against injustice. She has been a symbol for freedom fighters, feminists, nationalists, and revolutionaries. She has been claimed by many causes, interpreted in many ways, but always remembered. And that is no small thing. In a world where so many lives are forgotten, where so many struggles disappear into the void of history, Boudica endures. She endures because her story speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, the need to resist, to fight back, to refuse to be broken. She endured because she was brave when bravery seemed futile, because she stood when standing seemed impossible, because she fought when fighting seemed hopeless. She endures because she was, in the truest sense of the word, victorious, not in the outcome of battles, but in the indomitable strength of her spirit. So, as this story comes to a close, remember Boudica. Remember her when you face your own battles, your own injustices, your own moments of despair. Remember that empires, no matter how powerful, are built and maintained by people, and people can be resisted. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. Remember that even when you cannot win, the fight itself has value. And remember that history is not just written by the powerful, it is also written by those who dared to challenge them. Boudica challenged Rome, and Rome, mighty eternal Rome, was forced to acknowledge her. She earned her place in history not through conquest, but through defiance. Not through victory, but through courage. Not through survival, but through the willingness to die free rather than live in chains. She was the warrior queen who stopped Rome, if only for a moment. And in that moment, she became a legend. This is her story. This is her legacy. This is Boudica.